The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, soft waves of sand glowing beneath the fading light of evening. The sun rested low on the horizon, painting the sky in gentle shades of amber, rose, and pale violet. Nothing moved except the slow whisper of wind drifting across the dunes, carrying grains of sand like quiet thoughts traveling nowhere in particular. Elias had not planned to stop there. His old Jeep had begun to complain long before sunset, a faint rattle, then a deeper sigh from the engine, until finally it refused to go any farther. Accepting the stillness around him, Elias stepped outside and closed the door softly, as if loud sounds did not belong in such a peaceful place. The air was warm but calming, holding the lingering heat of the day. He took a slow breath. The desert had a way of silencing the noise inside a person's mind. No traffic, no voices, no urgency. Only space. That was when he saw it. Far beyond a low ridge of sand stood a shape that did not belong to nature. At first it looked like a mirage, a dark outline wavering in the warm air. But as Elias walked closer, step by careful step, the form became clear, a warplane. It rested quietly on the sand, tilted slightly to one side, as though it had grown tired and chosen this place to sleep. Its metal body was faded by sun and time, once painted markings softened into pale ghosts of history. One wing lay half buried beneath dunes that had slowly claimed it over years, maybe decades. There were no signs of struggle. No smoke, no damage that suggested violence. Only stillness. Elias approached slowly, instinctively lowering his footsteps. The plane felt less like wreckage and more like a forgotten memory. Wind passed through broken openings in the fuselage, producing a low, hollow tone, almost musical, almost like breathing. He placed a hand gently against the cool metal. It surprised him how calm he felt. Instead of danger, the aircraft carried a quiet dignity, as if it had completed its journey long ago and was now resting peacefully under the endless sky. The cockpit glass, clouded with dust, reflected the soft colors of sunset. Elias peered inside but could see little beyond shadows and drifting sand. Whoever had flown it was long gone, leaving only questions behind. The desert accepted everything eventually. As twilight deepened, the temperature began to fall. Elias sat beside the plane, leaning against its worn surface. Above him, the first stars appeared, faint at first, then brighter, filling the sky like scattered lanterns. The wind slowed. In that gentle silence, he felt an unexpected comfort, as though the abandoned warplane was not lonely at all. It seemed to welcome company without asking for anything in return. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the soft hum of the desert night beginning. Somewhere far away, a night bird called once, then faded into quiet, and beneath the rising stars, beside a forgotten aircraft resting in endless sand, Elias realized he was no longer in a hurry to leave. The desert, and the silent warplane, seemed to have a story waiting, one that revealed itself only to those willing to sit, breathe, and listen. Night arrived slowly, like a soft blanket settling over the desert. The last warmth of the sun faded from the sand, replaced by cool air that carried a quiet clarity. Above Elias, the sky deepened into a vast ocean of stars, brighter than he had ever seen in any city. He remained seated beside the warplane, listening. At night, the desert was not truly silent. Tiny sounds lived within it, distant wind brushing dune crests, grains of sand shifting gently, and the faint metallic whisper coming from the aircraft itself. As the temperature dropped, the plane's old frame expanded and contracted, producing soft clicks and murmurs, almost like it was speaking in its sleep. Elias found the sound strangely comforting. He opened his backpack and took out a small flashlight, though he hesitated before turning it on. The darkness felt peaceful, not threatening. Eventually curiosity won, and a warm beam of light cut softly through the shadows. The fuselage revealed details hidden during sunset. Scratches traced long journeys. Faded numbers rested beneath layers of dust. A symbol, once sharp and official, had nearly disappeared, erased slowly by wind and time. He walked toward the cockpit again. The ladder was partially buried, but still strong enough to hold his weight. Each step echoed quietly in the still air as he climbed. Inside, the cockpit smelled of dry metal and sand warmed by countless days of sunlight. The control panel remained intact, dials rested frozen in place. Switches waited patiently, untouched for years. Sand had gathered in corners like pale snow. Elias brushed a small area clean with his sleeve, revealing glass beneath. He imagined the pilot sitting there long ago, hands steady, eyes focused on the horizon. Not in panic, somehow the plane did not feel like the sight of fear. Instead, it carried the calm of a deliberate landing, as if the pilot had chosen this place. Elias sat carefully in the worn seat. The desert stretched endlessly through the cracked windshield. Under moonlight, the dunes looked like gentle waves on a silver sea. For a moment, he closed his eyes. The wind moved through broken openings again, creating a low, steady tone. Inside the cockpit, the sound deepened, surrounding him like distant music. His breathing slowed naturally, matching the rhythm. He felt as though the aircraft was keeping watch through the night, a silent guardian of empty land. A peaceful thought crossed his mind: perhaps nothing here was truly abandoned. The plane still existed, still shaped the wind, still offered shelter and quiet companionship. Outside, the moon rose higher, casting soft shadows along the wings. Sand sparkled faintly, reflecting pale light like scattered glass. Elias leaned back, feeling unexpectedly safe. He did not know why the plane had landed here. He did not know who had flown it or how long it had rested beneath the desert sky. Yet the mystery did not disturb him. Instead, it felt gentle, a story unfolding slowly, without urgency. Sleepiness crept in, the steady desert air, the rhythmic hum of wind, and the stillness of the endless night wrapped around him. His thoughts drifted like sand carried by breeze, lighter with each passing moment. Before sleep took him, Elias whispered softly into the quiet cockpit, almost without realizing it. "Were you waiting for someone?" The plane answered only with a soft metallic sigh, warm and patient, and beneath a sky filled with endless stars, the night keeper, old, silent, and forgotten by the world, watched over its first visitor in many years. Elias woke slowly, unsure at first where he was. For a few peaceful seconds, he remained still, wrapped in the gentle quiet that comes just before full awareness. Cool morning air brushed his face, and pale sunlight filtered through the dusty cockpit glass. Then he remembered, the desert, the warplane. He sat up carefully. Outside, dawn painted the world in soft gold and silver tones. Long shadows stretched across the dunes, and the sand looked smooth and untouched, calm as a sleeping ocean. For a moment, everything felt perfectly still. Then Elias noticed something unusual: footprints. They began a short distance from the plane, faint but unmistakable, pressed into the sand where the morning light revealed their shapes. He blinked, wondering if they were his own from the evening before. But these were different, lighter, narrower, and leading away from the aircraft toward the open desert. A quiet curiosity stirred inside him. Climbing down from the cockpit, he stepped onto the cool sand. The air carried the fresh stillness unique to early morning. Before heat and wind erased the delicate marks of movement, he followed the footprints slowly. They moved in a gentle line over a nearby dune, never hurried, never uneven. Whoever had made them had walked calmly, as though simply taking a morning stroll, at the top of the dune. Elias paused. The desert opened endlessly before him, glowing beneath the rising sun. The footprints continued a little farther, then gradually faded, erased by shifting sand until nothing remained, no person, no destination, only emptiness. Instead of fear, Elias felt a strange peace. The desert often reshaped itself overnight. Wind could carve stories into sand and remove them just as easily. Perhaps the marks were old, revealed briefly by changing light. Or perhaps they belonged to someone who had once found this same place and felt the same quiet pull. He turned back toward the plane. From a distance, the aircraft looked almost alive in the morning light. Its wings cast long protective shadows, and the metal surface reflected warm colors of sunrise. It no longer seemed like wreckage. It looked like a landmark, something the desert had accepted as part of itself. As Elias approached, he noticed another detail. Near the wing lay a small object half buried in sand. He knelt and brushed it gently clean. It was a leather glove, worn and cracked with age. The material felt fragile but carefully made, the kind a pilot might wear. He held it quietly in his hands. Time felt different here. Years did not seem heavy, they simply passed, leaving traces for patient observers. The glove carried no sadness, only presence. Proof that someone had once lived a moment beneath this same sky. Elias placed it carefully on the wing, where sunlight warmed it. The wind began to rise again, soft and steady. Sand drifted along the ground in thin ribbons, smoothing the surface of the desert. Within minutes, even his own footprints started to disappear. He realized then how gently the desert treated memories. It did not erase them out of cruelty, but out of calm acceptance. Everything rested eventually. A deep sense of stillness settled inside him. He brewed a small cup of coffee beside the plane using a travel stove, watching steam curl into the cool air. The simple ritual felt meaningful here. Shared silently with the resting aircraft, as the sun climbed higher, warmth returned to the world. Elias leaned against the wing, sipping slowly, listening once more to the quiet hum of wind passing through metal, the same steady sound that had lulled him to sleep. Somewhere within that sound, he felt the beginning of understanding. The plane was not merely abandoned, it was waiting. For what? He did not yet know. Morning settled fully over the desert, replacing the cool silence of dawn with gentle warmth. The sun rose without urgency, spreading light evenly across the dunes as if careful not to disturb their calm shapes. Elias sat beneath the wing of the warplane, finishing the last of his coffee while watching shadows slowly retreat. The aircraft looked different in daylight. Details hidden by night now revealed themselves quietly, small rivets along the metal skin, faint lines where panels met, and patches where sandstorms had polished the surface smooth. The plane carried age gracefully, like an old traveler resting after a long journey. Elias felt drawn to explore it more carefully. He walked along the fuselage, trailing his fingers across the metal. The warmth of the sun had already begun to settle into it, creating a comforting contrast to the cool morning air. Near the rear of the aircraft, he found a narrow hatch slightly open, its edge buried in sand. with gentle effort, he pulled it wider. Inside was a small compartment, not damaged, only forgotten. A layer of fine sand covered everything like soft dust in an unused room. There were storage straps, an empty container, and a small metal box secured to the wall. Elias hesitated before opening it, feeling as though he were stepping into someone else's memory. The latch released with a quiet click. Inside lay a notebook. Its cover was worn but intact, the pages yellowed with time. He lifted it carefully, brushing away grains of sand. The first page held handwriting, neat, patient letters written in faded ink, a pilot's journal. Elias sat down just outside the hatch where sunlight made reading easier. The wind softened, almost respectfully, as he opened to the first entry. The words were simple. Observations about weather, coordinates, long flights over empty land. Nothing dramatic. Yet the tone felt calm, reflective, written by someone who noticed small things, the color of clouds at sunset, the stillness of high altitude, the comfort of routine. Page after page carried the same peaceful rhythm, then the entries grew shorter. The pilot wrote about engine trouble, about choosing a safe place to land rather than risk the sky. There was no panic in the writing. Only acceptance. The final entries described searching for a wide, quiet stretch of desert, a place where landing would be gentle, a place like this. The last page contained only a few lines. The desert looks peaceful from above. If this is where the journey pauses, it is not a bad place to rest. Someone may find this someday. I hope they feel calm here. Elias closed the notebook slowly. The air around him felt warmer, softer somehow. He looked at the plane again, understanding settling quietly into his thoughts. The aircraft had not fallen from the sky in chaos. It had arrived intentionally, guided by steady hands seeking safety and stillness. The pilot had chosen peace. A breeze moved through the open hatch, turning a single page of the journal before stopping again. The sound resembled a quiet breath, an echo of presence rather than absence. Elias placed the notebook gently back inside the metal box but left the lid open for a moment longer, allowing sunlight to touch the pages. He imagined the pilot stepping out after landing, standing exactly where he now stood, looking at the same horizon. Perhaps they had watched the same sunset, listened to the same wind, and felt the same sense of quiet completion. There was comfort in that thought. Closing the box carefully, Elias stepped away and sat once more beside the wing. The desert stretched endlessly, unchanged yet full of unseen stories. The plane no longer felt mysterious, it felt understood, and as the wind passed softly through its frame again, Elias thought he could almost hear gratitude carried within the sound, a gentle echo of the pilot who had once guided it safely to rest. The sun climbed higher, turning the desert bright and golden. Heat shimmered gently above the dunes, blurring distant shapes until sky and sand seemed to melt into one another. Elias moved slowly, adjusting to the rhythm of the place. There was no reason to hurry here, and somehow the desert made rushing feel unnecessary. He sat in the narrow shade beneath the wing, watching the light change. Time passed differently in the open wilderness. Minutes stretched softly, unmeasured by clocks or schedules. The only markers were shifting shadows and the quiet movement of wind across sand. Elias found himself thinking about the pilot again, not with sadness, but with calm curiosity. The journal's final words stayed with him. I hope they feel calm here. It felt less like a message from the past and more like a gentle welcome. He stood and walked around the aircraft once more, this time noticing smaller details he had overlooked before. A small scratch shaped like a curved line near the nose. A faded marking partially hidden beneath sand. Even the way the dunes had formed around the landing gear suggested patience rather than destruction. The desert had not rejected the plane, it had embraced it. Near the tail, he discovered a narrow strip of fabric caught between metal panels. Carefully pulling it free, he realized it was part of a scarf, sun-bleached and soft with age. When the wind caught it, the fabric moved lightly, almost playfully. Before settling again, Elias tied it gently around a small protruding handle on the fuselage. The cloth fluttered quietly, adding a small touch of motion to the still aircraft. For the first time, the plane seemed less lonely. The afternoon heat deepened, encouraging rest. Elias returned to the cockpit and opened one of the side panels slightly, allowing air to move through. The wind created a steady, low sound, a natural lullaby made of metal and breeze. He lay back in the pilot's seat, eyes half closed. Outside, the desert glowed intensely, yet inside the cockpit shadows remained cool and peaceful. Dust particles drifted slowly through sunlight like tiny floating stars. His thoughts wandered without direction. He imagined the pilot's final day, not as an ending, but as a gentle arrival. Landing carefully. Stepping onto warm sand. Listening to silence after the roar of engines. Perhaps there had been relief in that moment, a deep breath after a long journey. The idea felt comforting rather than heavy. Elias realized that the plane did not represent loss. It represented completion, a journey brought safely to rest. Sleep nearly found him again, but instead he drifted into a quiet waking dream, listening to the wind's steady rhythm. Each sound felt familiar now. Like the breathing of a companion nearby. Hours passed unnoticed. Eventually, the sunlight softened, signaling late afternoon. The harsh brightness faded into warmer tones, and long shadows returned to the dunes. The scarf he had tied earlier moved gently in the breeze, catching the golden light. Elias stepped outside again. The desert was changing once more, preparing for evening. Colors deepened, the sky shifted toward soft orange and pale pink. The same peaceful feeling from the previous night returned, welcoming and calm. He realized he was no longer thinking about repairing the jeep or continuing his journey. For now, staying felt right. The abandoned warplane stood quietly beside him. No longer simply an object from the past, but a presence sharing the slow passing of the day. And as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Elias sensed that the desert still held more stories, ones that revealed themselves only to those willing to remain a little longer. Evening returned like a familiar friend. The sun lowered gradually, softening the sharp edges of the desert. Heat slipped away from the sand, replaced by a gentle coolness that made breathing feel deeper and easier. Elias stood beside the warplane, watching light flow across its metal surface as if the aircraft itself were slowly awakening to the calm of twilight. The scarf he had tied earlier moved lazily in the wind, its faded fabric glowing amber in the sunset. For a long while, he simply listened. The evening wind was different from the daytime breeze. It carried a quieter voice, slower, steadier, weaving through the openings of the aircraft and producing a soft, hollow harmony. The sound reminded him of distant waves meeting a quiet shore. He walked toward a nearby dune and climbed to its crest. From there, the plane appeared small against the vast desert, yet unmistakably present. Its wings stretched outward like open arms resting peacefully upon the earth. Elias sat down, drawing lines absent-mindedly in the sand with his fingers. He began to notice how the desert changed color moment by moment. Gold turned to copper, copper to rose, and finally to deep violet. Shadows lengthened until they blended together, smoothing the landscape into gentle shapes. As darkness approached, memories surfaced, not dramatic ones, just small moments from his life, quiet mornings. Familiar roads, conversations half remembered. The desert seemed to invite reflection without forcing it. He realized how rarely he had allowed himself to be still. Back in the world beyond the dunes, time always demanded movement. Here, nothing demanded anything. The plain did not ask questions. The desert did not expect answers, it simply allowed existence. When the sun finally disappeared, the temperature dropped quickly. Elias returned to the aircraft and prepared a small meal, eating slowly while sitting beneath the wing. Each sound, the soft clink of metal utensils, the whisper of wind, felt amplified by the surrounding silence. The first stars appeared again. He noticed them earlier this time, as though he had learned how to look properly. One by one, they filled the sky until darkness shimmered with quiet light. Inside the cockpit, moonlight entered through the cracked glass, illuminating the controls in pale silver. Elias ran his hand lightly over them, imagining the countless hours they had once guided flight through open skies. "Did you miss flying?" he asked softly, almost smiling at himself. The wind answered with a low tone passing through the fuselage, gentle and steady. He settled into the seat again, wrapping his jacket around himself as the night air cooled further. The plane creaked softly, not from weakness, but from age adjusting to temperature, like an old house settling for sleep. Outside, the scarf fluttered in slow rhythm. Elias closed his eyes. The sound of the evening wind blended with his breathing, creating a peaceful cadence. Thoughts slowed. Worries felt distant and unimportant. The desert held him in a quiet pause between past and future. Somewhere deep inside, he sensed that the pilot who had landed here long ago must have heard this same wind, felt this same calm, and understood something simple, that journeys did not always end in arrival, sometimes they ended in peace. Sleep came gently. The abandoned warplane stood beneath the stars, its shadow long and protective across the sand. While the evening wind continued its endless song, patient, timeless, and kind, and through the silent desert night, it felt as though neither Elias nor the plane were alone anymore. During the night, Elias dreamed. It was not a vivid or restless dream, but a slow and gentle one, unfolding like drifting clouds. He dreamed he was sitting in the cockpit, yet the plane was no longer resting in sand. The engine hummed softly, not loud or violent, just a steady vibration that felt alive beneath his feet. Outside the window, the desert moved far below, dunes stretched endlessly, glowing silver under moonlight. The aircraft glided smoothly through the sky, effortless and calm, as if carried by the wind itself rather than powered by machinery. In the dream, Elias did not feel surprise. He felt familiarity. His hands rested lightly on the controls. Though he did not remember learning how to fly. The plane seemed to guide itself, responding to the smallest movements, almost anticipating intention before action. A quiet presence filled the cockpit. He never saw anyone, yet he sensed another awareness beside him, patient, reassuring. Not commanding, not instructing, simply sharing the moment. The feeling carried warmth, like companionship without words. The horizon slowly brightened as dawn approached within the dream. Colors spread across the sky, pale blue, soft gold, and gentle pink, mirroring the desert mornings he had begun to know. The aircraft turned slightly, banking smoothly. Below, Elias saw the very place where the plane rested in reality, a small shape among endless dunes. From above, it looked peaceful, perfectly placed, as though it belonged there all along. A calm understanding filled him. The flight was not about leaving the desert. It was about remembering movement, remembering that even stillness contained motion in another form. The plane had flown its final journey not to escape, but to arrive. The hum of the engine softened, cloud-like mist surrounded the aircraft, and the sound of wind grew quieter until it blended with breathing itself. The dream faded gently, without interruption or fear. Elias opened his eyes. Morning light filled the cockpit. For a moment he remained still, listening to the real wind moving through the aircraft. The engine was silent, of course. The plane rested exactly where it had been. Yet the peaceful feeling from the dream remained, lingering like warmth after sunlight. He stepped outside. The desert greeted him with cool air and pale dawn colors. The scarf fluttered softly, welcoming the new day. Fresh light touched the wings, and tiny patterns formed in the sand where wind had passed during the night. Everything felt quietly renewed. Elias stretched and walked a slow circle around the aircraft. He noticed how naturally his movements had adapted to the environment: slower steps, deeper breaths, calmer thoughts. The urgency he had carried before arriving here seemed distant now. He sat near the nose of the plane and watched the sunrise. As the sun rose higher, its light reflected briefly off the cockpit glass, creating a bright flash that made the aircraft appear almost alive for an instant. As if remembering the sky, Elias smiled faintly. Perhaps dreams were simply another way of listening. Perhaps the desert spoke not through words, but through rest, silence, and imagination. He felt certain of one thing: the plane's story was no longer separate from his own. For reasons he could not fully explain, arriving here had changed the pace of his thoughts, teaching him something gentle about endings and beginnings. The day unfolded slowly before him, full of quiet possibility, and somewhere within the calm morning air, the memory of flight lingered, not as movement through space, but as a feeling carried forward inside him. The morning passed peacefully, unfolding without urgency. Elias spent hours doing very little, and for the first time in a long while, doing very little felt meaningful. He cleaned a small section of sand from the wing, adjusted the scarf when the wind loosened it, and sat quietly watching light travel across the desert floor. By midday, warmth returned, soft but steady. The horizon shimmered gently, and distant dunes appeared to float like islands in a golden sea. Elias rested in the narrow shade beside the plane, eyes half closed, listening to the familiar rhythm of wind moving through metal openings. That was when he noticed movement, far away, near the edge of visibility. A small figure crossed the sand. At first he thought it might be a trick of heat or light. The desert often shaped illusions from distance. But the figure continued slowly, steadily, approaching without haste. Elias stood, shading his eyes. It was a person, walking calmly, carrying nothing visible, moving with the relaxed pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going. There was no fear in Elias, only curiosity. The figure drew closer over time, and eventually he saw an elderly man wearing light desert clothing, loose and pale against the sun. His steps were measured, leaving soft footprints that the wind slowly softened behind him. When the man reached the plane, he stopped and looked at it for a long moment before noticing Elias. They exchanged a quiet nod. "Peaceful place," the stranger said gently, his voice calm and unhurried. Elias smiled. "It is." The man walked around the aircraft slowly, touching the metal with familiarity, as if greeting an old friend. His hand rested briefly on the wing, then on the fuselage near the cockpit. "I have seen this plane many times," he said. "From far away. The desert keeps it safe." Elias felt a quiet surprise. "You knew about it?" The man nodded. "The desert remembers everything. People forget, the desert does not." They sat together in the shade without formal introductions. Conversation came naturally, with long pauses between words that felt comfortable rather than awkward. The visitor explained that he lived far beyond the dunes, traveling occasionally across the desert to follow old paths known only by memory and stars. He spoke softly about wind patterns, migrating birds, and how sand changed shape each season. When Elias mentioned the journal, the man listened carefully. "A pilot who chose calm," the visitor said after a moment. "That is rare. Many fight the desert. Few accept it." The wind passed gently between them. For a while they said nothing. Silence itself felt like conversation, shared observation of the endless horizon. As afternoon softened toward evening, the man stood again. He looked at the plane one last time, eyes thoughtful but peaceful. "You came here because you needed stillness," he said kindly to Elias. "The desert gives what is asked without words." Elias considered replying, but found no need. The statement felt true. The visitor began walking away just as slowly as he had arrived. Elias watched as the figure grew smaller against the dunes, eventually blending into the landscape until only empty sand remained. No footprints lasted long. The encounter felt dreamlike, yet real, another quiet layer added to the place's story. Returning to the aircraft, Elias placed his hand against its warm surface. The metal hummed faintly with evening wind, familiar now, reassuring. The desert had offered him another presence, then gently taken it back, and as the sky began turning toward sunset once more, Elias sensed that his time here was slowly guiding him toward understanding, not through answers, but through moments of quiet connection. The abandoned warplane stood unchanged, yet everything around it, and within him, felt subtly transformed. The evening after the visitor left felt deeper than the nights before. Elias sat beneath the wing as the sun descended, watching colors spread slowly across the sky. Orange softened into rose, rose into violet, and finally into the calm blue of approaching night. The desert seemed to breathe more slowly, as if preparing for rest. The stranger's words lingered gently in his thoughts. "You came here because you needed stillness." Elias realized how true that felt. Before arriving, his life had been filled with constant motion, decisions made quickly, days passing without pause. Here, time had widened. Thoughts had settled like sand after wind. He stood and walked one last slow circle around the warplane. Every detail now felt familiar: the curve of the wing casting evening shade, the worn ladder leading to the cockpit, the scarf fluttering softly in the cooling air. What once seemed mysterious now felt comforting, almost like a temporary home. Inside the cockpit, moonlight began to gather again. Elias sat in the pilot's seat and looked out at the horizon, imagining the final landing described in the journal. He could almost feel the quiet relief the pilot must have experienced, choosing Earth over uncertainty, calm over struggle. He understood something new. The pilot had not been trapped here. He had decided to stop. Elias closed his eyes and listened carefully. The wind moved through the aircraft with its familiar low tone, steady and peaceful. It sounded less like a voice now and more like a reminder, gentle, patient. Outside, the first stars appeared. A thought formed slowly, without pressure. it might soon be time to leave, the idea did not bring sadness. Instead, it felt natural, like waking after enough sleep. The desert had offered rest, reflection, and quiet companionship. Staying forever was never the purpose. Journeys continued. He stepped outside and looked toward where his jeep waited beyond the dunes. Tomorrow, he could try repairing it again. Perhaps it would start easily. Perhaps not. Either way felt acceptable. Elias untied the scarf from the fuselage and held it for a moment. The fabric moved lightly between his fingers, warmed by the day's sun. After a pause, he tied it back exactly where it had been. Some things belonged here. He returned to sit beneath the wing one final time that night. The sky filled with stars brighter than ever, stretching endlessly above him. The plane stood silent beside him, unchanged yet deeply familiar. "Thank you," he said quietly, unsure whether he spoke to the pilot, the plane, or the desert itself. The wind answered with a soft, steady sigh. Sleep came easily. No dreams this time, only deep rest. The kind that leaves no weight behind. Only calm. Far into the night, the desert remained peaceful, guarding its stories beneath starlight. The abandoned warplane rested exactly as it always had, patient, timeless, and complete, and as dawn slowly prepared itself beyond the horizon, Elias sensed that morning would bring not an ending, but a gentle continuation of the path waiting beyond the dunes. Dawn arrived softly, as if careful not to wake the desert too quickly. A pale blue light spread across the horizon, followed by delicate gold that slowly warmed the sand. Elias opened his eyes beneath the wing of the warplane, feeling rested in a way he had not experienced for years. The air was cool and clear, carrying the calm promise of a new day. For a while, he remained still, listening. The wind moved gently through the aircraft one last time, producing the familiar low tone that had accompanied every night. It no longer felt mysterious. It felt like farewell, quiet, respectful, and complete. Elias stood and stretched, watching the sun rise behind distant dunes. Morning light touched the cockpit glass, reflecting briefly like a signal before settling into steady brightness. Today, he knew, he would leave, not because the place had lost its peace, but because he had found what he needed within it. He climbed into the cockpit once more. The seat welcomed him with familiar comfort. He rested his hands lightly on the controls, gazing out across the endless desert. For a moment, he imagined the aircraft lifting gently into the sky again, not with noise or force, but with the effortless calm of his dream. Then he smiled and stood. Outside, he walked slowly around the plane, offering silent gratitude. The scarf fluttered softly in the breeze. Now part of the aircraft's story. The sand carried faint traces of his presence, already beginning to fade. The desert did not hold tightly to anything. It allowed arrivals and departures with equal peace. Elias retrieved his bag and took one final look at the warplane. In the morning light, it appeared neither abandoned nor broken. It simply rested, a completed journey paused forever beneath open sky. He began walking toward the distant jeep, each step felt light. The urgency he once carried had dissolved, replaced by quiet clarity. He did not know exactly where he would go next, and for the first time, that uncertainty felt comforting. Halfway across the dune, he turned back. The aircraft stood small against the vast landscape, wings stretched beneath endless sky. Wind moved around it, shaping sand slowly, patiently, continuing the work of time. For a brief moment, sunlight reflected from the cockpit glass again, a gentle flash, like a distant greeting. Elias raised a hand in return, then continued walking. When he reached the jeep, he opened the door and turned the key. The engine hesitated, then started with a steady hum, as if it too had rested enough. He drove slowly at first, careful not to disturb the quiet morning. The plane remained visible in the mirror for a long time, growing smaller until it finally blended into the desert's endless patterns. Yet the calm he found there did not fade. It traveled with him, in slower breathing, softer thoughts, and a deeper appreciation for silence between moments. Far behind him, the abandoned warplane remained beneath the wide sky, listening to wind and watching stars, waiting not for rescue, but simply existing in peaceful completion. And somewhere beyond the dunes, another traveler might one day stop, sit beside its wing, and feel the same quiet gift the desert offered freely. Rest, stillness, and the gentle understanding that every journey, no matter how long, eventually becomes part of a larger calm.